Hello, and welcome to Writer's Revenge, a web series designed to make you a better writer. My name is Mark Major. I'm a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Writing Department, and I'm also your humble instructor for the series. If there's only one episode you listen to, make it this one my introduction to the course. I find it has the big answers that you will use over and over again in every single story. So in this episode, we're going to go through 3 separate sections. The first one, we're going to ask, what is the definition of a writer? In the second section, we're going to talk about the 2 main parts of a narrative, the plot and the details. And finally, I'll ask the question, where do stories come from and how do they end? Or rather, how do you end them? So let's begin. Here's something that is pre-course helpful hint. Before the course is even started, right out of the gate. How do you start a presentation? If you don't have a good way of starting it, start off with a definition. And that's what we're going to do for this course. And the first thing we're going to ask ourselves is, what is the definition of a writer? Now, instantly, everybody always jumps up, raises their hand. I got it. It's someone who writes, meaning it's the person who is holding the pen or the pencil or is using the keyboard or the keypad or they're dictating into a microphone. They're the person who captures the expression. And so that's an easy one that most people are going to throw out there. However, you're going to find that that's not really the definition, that is just some type of a physical act. It really doesn't help us as writers at all to approach it from that way. So then what might be another answer as to definition of a writer? Well, the next thing on the list, of course, is going to be, someone who writes, but it's a profession, it's a job, it's something that people are paid to do, meaning if you're paid to write, you are a writer. I would say that initially, looks pretty good in terms of like if A equals B kind of thing, but it's not necessarily true. Not all writers are paid, and that's not necessarily how we might define the craft of writing, is simply by there being a paycheck, and it doesn't really help us, right? It doesn't make you a better writer by, necessarily increasing, the amount of money you bring in. So then finally you're like, okay, we did our 2 guesses. It's the third one. Tell us what the definition of a writer is. And it is this: someone with a deadline, okay? Because until you have a deadline, you are never, ever going to finish what it is that you're working on. You can always improve it. It can always be better. It can always be longer. It's really about having a deadline, because once you have that deadline, all those things that as you were kind of coming up and thinking you're going to be a writer, that you were mocking and attacking and, rebelling against, all the tropes, all the formulas, all the mechanisms, all the cliches, right? All those kinds of things that you used to denounce, well, those are now all your best friends. And without those, you are not going to finish. You're not going to cross the finish line. You're not going to hit the deadline. You absolutely need all those tools. And so the sooner you recognize that someone with a deadline needs all the tools they can get to finish. Okay, let's move on to the second section. I think that bit of wisdom has struck home, and everyone's going to sit back and savor it. Let's move on to some more things that are going to help you out. All right, when we talk about the narrative, the best way of conceiving of it from a sort of big picture is to split it up into 2 elements. That is the plot and the details, okay? Now, none of what I'm going to tell you is something that I came up with. This is something that I learned in a comp lit course from a professor. It was a course on comedy and humor, and this is what I took away from it. This is part of his instruction. He says, think of the plot as being a type of clothesline, a linear line, A to B. And on this clothesline, there are hooks hanging there, dangling, And those are for you to put your details on. That is, you hang details off the hooks. That is what the plot is there for. It is there to hang stuff off of. Okay. And you go, well, yeah, I get that. That's not a big deal. Sure. But then this is what he said next to the class. He's like, and remember, people only care about the details. They do not care about the plot. And at first you're like, well, I see a lot of like YouTube channels of people going off on bad movies and how the plot's dumb and stuff like that. And so maybe it is about the plot. But as you realize the way movie making scripts and story scripts go, that in fact the instructor was completely right. When you think of a Quentin Tarantino film, it's really all about the details that he puts in. A lot of it is the details in the dialogue that the characters say. That's kind of how he got famous. He had sort of what's known as Mametian, after like David Mamet, blue-collar thugs, but who talk in very sort of Shakespearean ways. A lot of interesting details are in there. If we go back to Hitchcock, he described this thing in story writing and movie making as the MacGuffin, as a object that motivates the plot, right? It's the thing that everybody is after. Like in the Maltese Falcon, everybody is after this piece of artwork that looks like a bird. It's the Maltese Falcon, and everyone's running around trying to get it. By the end of the movie, we don't care where it is. We only care about our two main characters. And then an update to this would be like Raiders of the Lost Ark, where at the end of the film, this thing that everybody is like, they're on horses, they're jumping onto trucks, they're like dragging by trucks, they're punching people, they're, hanging onto submarines, trying to get this thing. At the end of the movie, we don't care. It's just stuffed in some warehouse. It doesn't really matter. And that's the MacGuffin. And that's kind of like the plot in a sort of big picture way of approaching it. It's just there to move the story along so that you can hang your details, and that's all the audience really wants are details. Let's move on to section 3. I think everyone's going to get what I just said, and it's going to make a lot of sense, and it's going to sort things out for you as you continue your career. So, where do stories come from, and how do you end them? Because you often hear how people are working on a story or working on a script and they don't know how it ends. And that's always been kind of baffling to me, because where stories come from is they're events that have happened to you, the writer, okay? The story has already happened. You know how it ends. You were there, you saw it begin, you saw the horrible mess that was the middle of it, and you saw how it ended. Your job as a writer is now to take that experience and transform it into a story for others. So it's not like, well, how am I going to end this? It's not about that, because it's really, how am I going to tell this? You should already have it. And anytime you hear, movie news about working on a movie and how they had to change the ending and they didn't know how it was going to end, that is a bad sign. That is a very bad sign that they're not really making a movie, but rather they have a bunch of clips that just go together and hoping that they can charge you money for it. So when I say it's already happened to you, what am I really talking about? Well, I'll give you a couple examples, and hopefully this will sort of clear things up. The first one is, say you're a guy who takes the bus every day to work. I think we've all been someone who's taken the bus like every day for a while for whatever reason. So one day you get on the bus and a guy gets on the bus with a shotgun. There's like a lot of guns out there, right? They're not rare. And there's a lot of shotguns that have been produced, that have been manufactured, and they're out there regardless of people's carrying laws and whatnot. These are not like uncommon things. They're somewhat rare to see in like a city, but it's not the wildest thing ever. But when a guy gets on your bus in the morning to work with a shotgun, that's a story. And then something would happen next to you involving this guy and the shotgun on the bus, so that when the event was over and you got off the bus and you finally got to work and you check in at the office, the first thing you start doing is you start telling people about what just happened on your ride into work on the bus and a guy who got on with a shotgun. It's now a story. And the thing is, how are you going to tell it? What are you going to do? How are you going to frame it? And that's kind of what this series is about. It's the different steps to take an existing thing that's happened to you and be able to turn it into a story. And usually because you have a deadline, okay? And that means you need to get that story down as quickly as possible and ship it, right? Let's take another example of this in action so you can see what I'm saying to you. Let's go back to the original Star Wars that came out in 1977 when it was just called Star Wars. There was no A New Hope. There was no 9 chapters, 6 chapters, 3 chapters. It was one movie. They had no plans of making sequels. They didn't think to even keep the sets. They destroyed all that stuff. They destroyed a lot of the props. People individually kind of walked off with stuff and saved some of it. At one point, they were going to stop filming the movie because it was over time and over budget. This is for people that don't know that this was an art film a long time ago. So, what is the subtext, the story of Star Wars? It's similar to the story of George Lucas. Lucas and Luke are essentially the same person. The story of Star Wars, the first movie, is George's story of the first part of his adult life. Essentially, he grew up in a small Northern California town. His dad owned a printing shop. He liked to do things like racing cars. He liked speed, stuff like that. But he also wanted to be a filmmaker. And what he wanted to do, George Lucas, is he wanted to go off with his rebellion friends, Steven Spielberg, Brian De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola, Ben Birch. These are the guys who were like the rebel filmmakers, and he was going to go off, or he wanted to go off and join them, and together this rebellion was going to take down the movie industry, i.e. the Empire, with a big hit. And that's kind of what Star Wars is. The actual sinking of the Death Star is George Lucas in this very movie, Star Wars, sort of sinking of the old guard, the Empire, right? But it's really just the story of George Lucas and his dad, because his dad didn't want this. His dad wanted him to stay on the farm, so to speak. He wanted him to enter into the family business, into the print shop, because he didn't have faith in his son. He didn't think his son was going to be a success. He was afraid that his son was going to be a failure, and he didn't want his son to sink into poverty and that he would have to probably, maybe like bail him out or pay for him. And he wanted him to do the safe thing, stay in a small town and run the family print shop. So what George is doing is he's writing something about himself into the story. And when you go back to like the movie that everyone says they like the most and the one that they always say that they hate the least, it's almost always the original Star Wars. And because it actually has a real genuine story to it, and the real genuine story is the actual story of George Lucas as a young adult, as he's trying to leave the house, the farm, on the desert planet. I think it was pretty lush where he grew up, but he was wanted to leave the farm to go join the rebels in their fight against the film industry in the film industry. So that is where stories come from. You shouldn't have any problem ending them. You should know the ending before you begin. All right, this has been the first and introductory episode to Writer's Revenge. I suggest that you subscribe to this, as I will be adding more courses every week, and I guarantee after you go through the Writer's Revenge courses, you will become a better writer.